floor to both of you with a lot of gratitude. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction and for inviting us. It's really exciting to talk to your group, and hopefully, people will bring very different perspectives, and we'll try and make sure we keep some time for discussion. I'm going to start with just a few comments on attitudes to accents in Britain generally, and then I'll introduce our project, and I'll present a number of our results, but try and keep the big picture in sight. And I'll try and keep it to about half an hour and then hand over to Young, who will talk about some recent related work that he's been doing. So one of the most famous quotes about accents in the UK to start with, George Bernard Shaw famously said, "The moment an Englishman opens his mouth, another Englishman despises him." And in a sense, that's the starting point for all research on accents in the UK. But as you know, this quote refers to the very, very long-standing patterns of inequality and accent-based evaluation in the UK. And this has, of course, affected professional outcomes. So it's not just that in this project we were interested in people's attitudes in the abstract, but also how it affects life outcomes and professional hiring in particular. So we know that accent is a key signal of social background, and it can impede access to elite professions. So especially some time ago, there were smaller studies that showed professional inferences based on accent. But it's surprising how underexplored the role of accent is in perpetuating unequal outcomes in this country. There's a lot more done in the US, but in fact, I would say the UK is kind of legendary for its attention to accent in organizing its social hierarchy. And also, there haven't been large-scale surveys using audio stimuli. There's been more using accent labels. So our project set out to do these two related, to address these two related goals. One is just to document contemporary attitudes to accents in Britain, but also to look at the more applied side of what the impact might be in professional contexts. So the project has been a 3-year project between Queen Mary and the University of York. So it brought together linguists in the north and south of England, and also a psychologist, as Young is on the project. And we've also worked with members of the law departments in both universities, because law was the sector that we focused on. So overall in the project, we did a number of sub-studies, and I'm going to summarize these briefly for you today. We looked at attitudes simply to accent labels. So just what do you think of Cockney, Yorkshire English, so on. And that was a smaller part of the project, and it was to replicate earlier work to see how attitudes might have changed or not. But we also did research on attitudes to audio stimuli, so how people respond when they hear a real voice. And then a third part of our research has been looking at reactions not in just in the general UK public, but among lawyers and legal professionals in law firms, to look even more directly at the relationship of attitudes to processes in the professional sector. And then we've also been looking at perceptual evaluations in real time, so how people's judgment of a person change while they're listening to them. And we're designing and testing anti-bias interventions. But today I'm going to just summarize the first 3 of these. So attitudes to labels of accents among the general public, attitudes to voices, and attitudes in the workplace among legal professionals. And what I'm going to focus on is a general observation of attenuation of bias across these 3 studies. They're designed slightly differently, so our conclusion that bias attenuates or gets milder across the studies is indirect, but I'd like to focus on that because it raises the interesting question of how fixed our attitudes are, or whether they're actually more complex and more plastic or more flexible according to context. So because I want to take this kind of big picture approach, and this has been quite a substantial project, I'll be presenting some results quite superficially, just to give you an idea of what we found, but to keep the focus on this overall comparison of strength of bias in different studies that we did with different settings. So let me start with the first study where we looked at attitudes to accent labels. So in this case, as I said, we mainly wanted to replicate an earlier study that was done 15 years ago, and more indirectly replicate a study that was trying to replicate, which was 50 years ago. So this replication gives us 3 time points over half a century. And so we conducted this survey of attitudes to accent labels with a representative sample of the UK public, so over 800 participants, and respondents simply rated 38 accent labels for prestige and pleasantness. And this was exactly following the design of Nick Coupland's work and his colleagues about 15 years ago. And Howard Giles in 1970 had done an earlier study. I'll give you some details of that in a minute. And the main finding from this study of accent labels was the lack of change. So here you can see the top 9 or 10 rankings out of these 38 accent labels that we presented the UK public with. And you can see almost no change at the top, which accents float to the top of the ranking across the study that we did with 2019 data and then 15 years earlier. And at the bottom of the ranking, we also see this stability. So we see just slight re-rankings, and we had a couple more distinctions for London and London area accents, which slotted in at the bottom of the ranking. But this is the prestige ranking, and we see real stability at the top and bottom, in fact, throughout the hierarchy. So very little change. And then when we add in Howard Giles's findings for 1969 data, so here we have fewer accents because he only looked at 14, with slightly not exactly the same type of survey. We see this enduring hierarchy of prestige over half a century. So we see national and inner circle, so American, so native overseas accents, and also interestingly a foreign accent, French, and own accent, which is consistently rated high. When people are asked an accent similar to your own, they tend to rate it high, even when they rate their own region low sometimes. So it's an interesting detail. We see those consistently near the top. And then we see what have been described as industrial or working class accents, and also ethnically marked or ethnic minority varieties low ranked. So we see a very stable set of rankings emerging again and again. The only difference we might see, if you look at the blue line, which is our findings, and the ordering here is according to our findings, is that the lowest ones are slightly less low and RP has gone down slightly. So there's a little bit of flattening, but you can see that the overall system is in place. Another detail in this accent labels study, the first study that I'm showing you, is that we found significant age differences across ratings. So a third of the accents had a significant age difference between younger than age 45 and older. And in most cases, that was younger listeners giving higher ratings. And if you ignore over 65s in the chart that you see here, so that's because those numbers are smaller and that's quite a variable group. You see that there's a tendency for the 15 to 24 to be higher and the others, the middle age groups to be lower, both in our data and in Nick Coupland and colleagues' data from 15 years earlier. So although we could see the orange line, our current line, as real social change, that younger people are no longer like older people and that pattern is going to continue, what we think we're actually seeing is age grading, what sociolinguists call age grading, which is that in your lifespan you change your attitude. So let me show you a little bit in a little more detail what that looks like by accent. So we're still talking about the accent labels results, and Coupland and Bishop also noticed a tendency for younger people to have less negative ratings. And they say young people, quote, are less embedded in the conservative ideology of positively evaluating standard accents. And we find this very clearly. So if you see the chart here and you look at the dark green and the blue lines, you see that they go downwards with age. So younger people in our data have higher ratings than older people for foreign and ethnic heritage accents, as well as working class and industrial town accents. Whereas the orange lines go slightly upward with age, and these are UK national and traditional rural, so Edinburgh, Scottish, Cornish, West Country. And there you see a preference among older listeners. And I haven't given you the 2004 data from Nick Coupland's work, but it shows the same tendencies. So what we see here is really a tendency, not just an age pattern, but a kind of normativity in midlife, where the judgment of stigmatized dialects goes down and the judgment of nationally valued dialects goes up. So we have this interesting age pattern that does not seem, when we look across studies over these 50 years, to be change in society. It seems like we have a regular, consistent change in lifetime, that people get more conservative and normative in their judgments in their lifetime. So I won't go through more findings on accent labels, because I want to show you the other two studies results, but this slide just shows you other significant effects that were found, and these were analyzed exactly like Nick Coupland and Howell Bishop's work to be able to compare directly. So we found some loyalty effects, including self-directed bias effects, but also in-group loyalty. We saw an effect of people's personal stance towards diversity. We saw a loss of gender effects, and ethnicity is not analyzed in the earlier studies, so we didn't, but we did find some indications of ethnic effects as well. But overall, what we found, the main finding for accent labels is this very established hierarchy of prestige and stigmatized dialects in place for 3 different studies over 50 years. In their concluding discussion, Bishop et al. Note that this kind of conceptual accent evaluation, so evaluation of accent labels, might be tapping into very conservative ideologies of language, but it might obscure what we're interested in here is contextual effects. Because when you just ask someone about an accent label, you're giving them almost no context. You're just giving them a kind of a name, a stereotype almost. And so they themselves raise this concern about what are we actually accessing when we look at accent labels. So what we want to know next is, are such accent preferences equally evident when people hear real voices, when they can hear that this is a real person in front of them and in a specific situated context? So the second study I'm going to show you is where we examined attitudes to real voices. As I said, there are a lot of detailed results for this study, and I'm just going to give you these snapshots. So it might be a bit frustrating. You see, our results, but I'll just tell you very briefly what they show, because I want to keep in sight the comparison of the strong accent judgments of accents when we saw labels, and we're going to see that they're slightly mitigated when people hear voices. So in order to look at how people react to voices, we did a verbal guise study with, again, a representative sample of the population in England, so over 800 participants. And listeners, in this case, evaluated the interview performance of candidates that they were hearing, so recorded voices, who they were told were applying for a trainee solicitor position at a corporate law firm. And the candidates they heard were young men, native speakers of 5 accents, 2 speakers per accent, to check for speaker effects. And the 5, we can't look at 38 accents with this kind of a design. It's not feasible. So we looked at 5 accents, received pronunciation, so standard middle class standard accent for England. Estuary English, so we call it estuary English, so it's a more Cockney end of estuary English, a working class white London accent. Multicultural London English, which is the new East London accent, working class as well, but multi-ethnic. general Northern English, which is a recently developed kind of a Northern standard middle class, and urban West Yorkshire English, working class Leeds accents. So these were selected so that we would have Northern and Southern accents and middle class and working class accents. And within Southern working class, we have a white associated variety and a multi-ethnic associated variety for London working class. So the stimuli that that listeners were presented with were audio responses to interview questions. Some of them required legal expertise and others were focused on general professional skills, and we developed these with lawyers and tested them extensively. So just to clarify, the design of the project was between subjects, so people would hear 10 responses to 10 different questions, and all different speakers across 5 accents. But over the whole data set, we were able to compare identical responses in different accents because of the design of the study. So in the results I present to you, we're presenting the rating of accents for exactly the same interview response. So just so you can hear the accents, I'll play you just very short clips so you can associate these accent names with the voices that people heard. I hope you can hear it.
I worked as a part-time shop manager. I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Maria, you can just interrupt me if you're not hearing the audio, because I'm not looking at faces.
No, I know, but everything is fine. Everything is very well so far.
So that was the standard voice. Play it one more time.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
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 Okay, so hopefully you can get a feel for those 5 accents that we are examining. And so, sorry, listeners rated all 10 speakers that they heard. Each listener heard different interview questions, but across listeners, we collected data for the same interview questions in different accents. We asked a number of different evaluation questions, but they were very highly correlated. So the results we present are combined results for these questions. We didn't separate them in the analysis. Okay, so after rating the listeners, after listening to the interview questions and rating them, we collected demographic background from our listeners, their beliefs about social mobility, some of their opinions and attitudes, but also a kind of more psychological detail that hasn't been looked at very often in past attitude studies, which is what their personal motivation was to control a prejudiced response. So how much they worried about being seen as prejudiced. Okay, so I'm going to show you a number of results from this study of voices, but the way I'm going to go through it is to show you different ways in which this very different kind of context compared to the labels study I presented might have given rise to milder bias effects. So we still see bias, but we see it much more conditioned by different contextual factors. And the first thing to note, which you can see here, is that we don't have a significant main effect for accent on its own. And you can see here that the ratings are within the range of 6 on average. So they're very close, but because we have a large sample, we still see some significant differences. But if you remember, I'm not sure you remember, but in the label study where we had a scale from 1 to 7, we had ratings ranging from 3 to 5. So the use of the scale was much wider. And so already we see here with the non-significance of any main effect of accent that we have possibly a subtler kind of response going on to voices. One of the main reasons that we don't have a main effect of accent is that accent interacts very strongly with age. And that's what we also found in the label study. So this kind of reinforces that finding. So when we look at the responses to accents according to age, we can see, first of all, that older listeners are much more critical and less favorable overall in their ratings. So you can see all the lines going down for all the accents. So grumpy older people like me rating accents more critically, and younger listeners being more positive. But this effect interacts with accent. So younger respondents with the boundary approximately around age 45 do not show significant differences in their rating of these 5 accents. Whereas when we get to above 45 as a group, we see significantly lower ratings of the 2 Southern working class accents, Estuary English and Multicultural London English, relative to the other 3. Because of the similarity to the labels result and similarity to some earlier findings, it's not entirely clear whether this, again, is real change in society, that younger people represent the new Britain and people no longer care about accent discrimination, or whether it's because they're young and when they get older, they're going to behave like these older people. But our sense, based on the labels and previous studies, is that it's actually the latter. It's more likely to be the latter, which is that it's a lifespan effect, not a real change in progress. So we've seen age as one of the conditioning factors on how strong bias is, but we also saw a number of other factors governing how significant the differences in ratings between accents were. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these really quickly. One is, if you remember, we had 2 different types of questions. We had 5 questions that involved evidence of legal expertise, because the question was about something to do with law, and 5 that were to do with things like tell us about when you worked in a team and general kinds of interview questions. And what we see here is an effect of expert content. So you can see that for all listeners, expert questions were rated slightly higher. Hopefully you can see that. So there is an effect of content on how they're rating these accents. In some cases, the interaction with expertise eliminates accent bias completely. For Midland speakers, if you look, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but look at the middle lower frame, you can see that expertise trumps all of the accent effects except for MLE, non-expert responses, which were significantly lower than RP. But for the Southern listeners, so this is also older Midlands, but for the older Southern listeners, both Estuary English and MLE, the working class Southern accents, are downgraded relative to RP regardless of expertise, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these multiple interactions, but the main point to take away is that expertise was actually leading to a lack of bias for some listeners, where they were hearing expert content and accepting it as evidence of competence for the job, for instance. But there are these subgroups where expertise doesn't override the bias. Okay. Another mitigating factor that we found was motivation to control a prejudice reaction. So not wanting to be seen as exhibiting a prejudiced response. And here again, you can see that people with a high motivation to control such a response, so wanting to not exhibit such a response, you can see the gray lines are higher, whereas people who responded saying they didn't worry too much about that kind of a perception of themselves gave lower ratings. And again, we see this interacting with age and the region of the listener, with the same 2 groups still downgrading either Estuary English or both Estuary English and MLE relative to RP. But here you can see that it's the older listeners with low motivation to control the prejudice response who are responding like that. So again, this is a detailed result, but the main point is that when we start to look at such psychological factors as well, we see a mitigating effect where somebody with a high commitment to control such responses is not showing the biases that others might. Okay, and a final detail I'm just mentioning because it was an interesting result that's also shows a different result across the accents, is how strong someone's accent is. So we found an interesting effect of accentedness, which is also a variably mitigating factor. So for the northern accent, so what we did here was find extracts with the same dialect density. So mild and strong here have the same number of non-standard features present for both MLE and northern. But the mild and strong, you can see the two bluish, greenish bars on the right, don't have a significant difference. So listeners didn't mind a strong northern accent relative to a mild one. But for MLE, you see, in fact, the milder accented speaker almost being rewarded, getting quite high ratings, and the strong accented speaker being downgraded with a significant difference. So here, a further factor of how strong your accent is seems to be playing in for certain accents. I should note that MLE is the only racialized accent out of the 5, so it's notable that there's this kind of penalizing of a strong accent here. So just to pull together the findings for voices, we found that the hierarchy of accent prestige that we found for labels is mitigated. So it's a bit, we see similar biases present, but they're more conditional, they're more limited when people are hearing real voices and when that person is in a mock interview, which may have implications for their, for their success and their life outcomes. So we saw moderation by age, by how much expertise the person was hearing, and by the listener's motivation to not seem prejudiced, and also effects of accent strength. So the main takeaway from the voices study is that the range of differences in accent rating was a bit smaller, and although we still see bias, we see how finely it can be conditioned by other contextual factors. Okay, so we still see bias, but to a reduced extent. And the last, I'm going to hand over to Yang soon, but the last study I'll show you very briefly is a study where we worked with lawyers and legal professionals. So for instance, recruiting graduate recruiters in law firms. And we looked at whether these biases are found equally among professional recruiters with a focus on quality in an expert context. So the UK general public may not be able to assess whether this is a good candidate for a law firm, but lawyers should be able to. So do they still show the bias? And in a real workplace. So here we, Nothing. Here we repeated the verbal guise study that I just showed you with lawyers and legal recruiters, but the number is small because it's very hard to go into law firms and get lawyers to do your survey. So we have to bear that in mind. It's a much smaller study. But again, they were judging the interview performance of candidates. The same candidates, same accents. Unlike the previous study, all the questions required technical expertise, and we also had a difference in design because there was a risk that lawyers would simply hear, decide, well, my law firm is, the reputation of my law firm is at risk. I'm not going to downrate any non-standard speaker. I can guess what these researchers are after. I'll just give high ratings to all the non-standard accents. We didn't want that to be a possibility. So we developed quality differences with marginally better or worse responses. And we pre-tested these with lawyers. So the lawyers who were doing the survey couldn't simply upvote MLE, for instance, because some of the MLE responses were less good than others. And we wanted to know if they could hear that independent of accent. Hopefully that's clear. I can clarify later if you have questions. And the main thing that we found that you can see here, so we used random forest analysis to identify candidate factors and then used numerous regression models to check for effects. The main thing we found was overwhelmingly that response quality, these marginal differences in whether the responses were better or worse, were the basis of ratings. So lawyers did very well attending to whether the answer was good or bad, regardless of accent. We did not find a main effect for accent. We didn't find age effects. We didn't find accentedness effects or any of the others. So lawyers did very well. And I can talk about how people respond to that finding. For instance, journalists are not always happy to see that lawyers did well. The only detail that you can see is RP responses, good RP responses were slightly downrated, which is an interesting effect. That might be because there are higher expectations for those speakers. But the main finding is that the other factors I just talked about were not present. We didn't really see bias at play. We saw an excellent ability to detect slight differences in quality independent of accent. So we don't conclude from this that lawyers are angels and they don't have bias. Our conclusion is that it's very likely that they are controlling their preferences and setting them aside for the task. And remember that they are doing this in the workplace, and they're experts who are trained to focus on content. They've even had training for widening participation and so on. So we'll come back to that. So just to show you that we really don't, why we don't really say that they don't have any bias. If we look at professionals from the same socioeconomic bracket in our second study, the nationwide study, we do see the tendency of bias among those. So it's not that professionals per se don't have these biases. In that study, they show the same biases, but in this targeted workplace setting, lawyers being asked to rate candidates for their own profession, they focused very well, as they should, on whether the answer was good or bad. So we don't see bias in these responses. Quality of response was the focus, but we conclude not that bias is absent, but rather that it's controlled. So just to end and hand over to Yang, I just want to comment on this kind of gradation or attenuation of bias that we found. So first I talked about accent labels, and we saw very sharp rankings and distinctions. People were very comfortable saying thumbs down Birmingham, thumbs up RP. And when we shifted to voices, we introduced a lot more context, and we found much narrower distinctions being made. Within that, we do find some bias still. And recent work, so Catherine Hilton and Sunwoo Jeong have looked at what they call contextual enrichment. So they say when there's little contextual information, participants might rely heavily on the target linguistic feature to form impressions. But here we're giving context, and we saw things like expertise and so on, reducing the reliance on accent differences. And then when we got to the workplace, we introduced even more in a sense. So we go to a high expertise groups with a focus on the task of hiring, which they engage in regularly. So we've been thinking about this in relation to a theory in psychology, the theory of planned behavior, because we feel that in order to look at how context factors in, it's very helpful to look at this theory, which distinguishes between general attitudes and attitudes that are part of behavioral processes. So in a sense, the label survey we did is so decontextualized that it relies on general attitudes, which Aizen talks about as often reflecting wider societal ideologies. But when we looked at voices, we introduced actions that are linked, attitudes that are linked to behavior, so the action of hiring, the context of interviewing a specific target. And so attitudes towards those behaviors, norms for that setting, and perceived control of behavior become more relevant, and in the workplace possibly even more so. So the last comment I'll make is we're working on anti-bias interventions and testing whether they work. And so for us, this kind of a framing helps us focus on where people might feel the most responsibility to control their behaviors and their reliance on accents. I think the one positive takeaway from this that I like to emphasize is the lawyer results suggests that we can set aside biases. So it's a kind of contribution to unconscious bias studies where we're not completely at the mercy of our unconscious biases. We showed that the attention and the context of workplace could actually get people to set these aside. So there's some hope, I guess. So that's the end of my bit, and I'll just hand over to Yang. Maybe I'll stop sharing, and then we can swap.
Perfect. Thank you, Devyani.
I'm just going to try to share my screen.
Yeah. Yes, I've seen some questions in the chat, but we will take them at the end, if that's all right, everybody. Thanks, Yang.
Okay, just to follow up Devyani's talk, this is some study. This is a study that my bachelor student, Katie Reeve, and I ran just a few months ago. So this is quite fresh data. We found some evidence for industry-specific accent bias in the judgments of job candidates. So just as Devyani has mentioned, in our previous findings, we found no supporting evidence for accent bias in the overall evaluation of job candidates. But the question remains is that could there be more biases that are more context specific? For example, in our previous studies, we asking participants to make judgment just about the overall performance of the candidates. But what if we ask them to make judgment in relation to very specific jobs or industry sectors? Now, the background on this draws theories from social cognition. Just curious, are you seeing the full screen, or are you seeing the screen with the presenter view? I'm just curious.
Presenter view.
Okay, I'm going to I just realized that this is the screen. Let me just share a different screen. So if I share this and I present, are you seeing the full screen now? Can you see the full screen?
Yeah, full screen now.
Okay, good. In the social cognition, we've long found that a lot of the attitudes and prejudice, they are context dependent. For example, what we call automatic evaluations or implicit attitudes can depend on context, which means that we like the same person in some context and hate the same person in some other context. And previous research on prejudice has also found that implicit prejudice is also context dependent. They found that white participants' automatic attitudes towards Black is modulated by the context cues against which the Black targets are presented against, such as a church interior versus street corner. And there are theories that a prejudice itself could be understood as a form of attitude in context. And according to Eagley and Dickman's theory, the prejudice is the result of mismatch between two sets of beliefs. One is what I call group stereotypes, which is beliefs about attributes of certain members of social groups. And the other is what I call the role stereotypes, which is beliefs about attributes that can facilitate success in social roles. So this theory, this model is more about beliefs, and I think it fits perfectly into our research on accent bias. So when it applies to the case of accent bias, we can see that if accents are signals of certain social background of the speaker, such as class or ethnicity or education, and if the stereotypes of certain roles, or in this case, certain jobs, such as bartending jobs versus office jobs, also contain these attributes with regard to class or education, then those who speak in the multicultural London English will perceived as match for certain jobs that are more working class jobs, and a mismatch for upper middle class jobs. And so is the speaker of received pronunciation for mismatch for bar jobs, and the match for office jobs. So the hypothesis is quite simple. So what if we ask them to make evaluation that are more job specific? So we predict that there will be a moderated effect, that this industry sector will moderate the bias, so that for working class bar jobs MLE is considered as a better fit, therefore they have more likelihood to succeed than RP speakers, when RP is more likely to succeed in office jobs than MLE speakers. So our procedure, we have 120 participants. We had them listen to one candidate's interview of 2 audio clips. So the accent is manipulated as a between subjects factor. And we chose 2 generic clips. So these are generic questions instead of questions about laws. Okay, so here, these are the 2 questions when you work in a team, when you solve a problem. So they're recorded with the same script. They listened to these 2 clips and then evaluated the candidate. They provided first the overall judgments and then job-specific judgments. So here are the overall judgments questions, which are very similar to the ones that Devyani presented before, including overall quality of the answer, the friendliness of the candidate. So these are highly correlated, so we aggregated scores into a single score of overall rating. But we also made job-specific judgments. We have 12 questions, and these 12 questions are sorted into can be categorized by 2 factors. One is the type of job. The other is the level of job. So we ask questions by entry-level jobs for that job type and senior level job for that job type. We also ask them to make 2 types of judgments. One is the likelihood to obtain a job, right? So to keep it in the level playground, because there's entry-level jobs and there are senior-level jobs. So we specify that for entry-level jobs for the next 0 to 5 years, and senior-level job, they should think in terms of 15 to 20 years. So to put these 2 type of levels of jobs at a kind of a level playground. And we also asked a set of questions on if they are hired for the job, how successful do you think they are going to be? So 2 sets of questions. And these are the 6 types of jobs that we presented to the participants. As you can see, we have bar jobs, which is in the food and beverage service industry. This is I think the SIC code. Office job, which is in the administrative and the support service industry, and bank jobs, which is the financial industry. And for entry-level jobs and senior-level jobs, we have bartender, bar manager, entry-level clerk, executive manager in the public sector, junior analyst in a large bank like Lloyd's, senior portfolio manager in a large bank. So they make judgments on all these 6 jobs and on these 2 sets of questions. Okay, how likely they can obtain this job, how likely they're going to succeed in these jobs. So that, and this is retrospective, but I was thinking, how do I describe the differences between these jobs? So I looked into the annual average pay by sector, and found out these are how much they are on average in the UK. Employees in these sectors are being paid. So you can see that in the bank industry, they are paid significantly more, and food and beverage service paid the least. So this is the finding on overall judgments. We didn't find we conducted one-way ANOVA, and we found the effect of accent to be non-significant. So the evidence is not strong enough to suggest there's an accent bias. Therefore, we cannot accept that there's an accent bias. Hence, so this basically replicates the findings we've had before. So in terms of overall judgments of the candidates, we couldn't find evidence supporting the accent bias. But what's interesting is when we started looking into these job-specific judgments, and again, this is the finding on the likelihood for obtaining the job. We did a very complex mixed ANOVA, and we found this significant 2-way interaction between the type of jobs, which is bar, office, and bank, and the accent, which is RP and MLE. And this is the graph that depicts this interaction. Okay, and we found that on the banking industry, for the bank jobs, there's a significant difference between RP speaker and MLE speaker. okay, which indicating that RP speaker is more perceived as more likely to obtain a bank job than MLE speaker. And this is the perceived likelihood for succeeding in a job had they actually obtained a job. Again, we found a similar two-way interaction between job types and accent, which is also significant. But in this case, none of the differences between RP and MLE speakers are significant in each of these job types. Okay. But another way of looking at the data is that we could look at comparisons within each speaker across 3 different jobs. Now, this should be treated with a little bit of a caution because we had the order fixed, so that there could be some order effect here. But what we found is that when you look at the MLE speaker, which is the red line, and again, this is for succeeding, likelihood for succeeding in a job. For the MLE speaker, the likelihood, the perceived likelihood decreases from bar to office job to bank job. Now, for the RP, there is no difference between bar and office job, but there is a difference. There's a drop in terms of likelihood for succeed from office job to bank job, which is similar to MLE. Now, it depends how you look at it. You can say that, okay, it might be in this case that MLE speakers are perceived as more likely to succeed in a bar than office. Okay. So again, these are just results from some preliminary analysis, and we're still looking at the data. But overall, I think that we didn't find any evidence for accent bias in the overall evaluation. This is in line with our previous findings in the same project. But we did find evidence for industry-specific accent bias. And it seems like as the status of the industry increases, the MLE speakers started to become more disadvantaged. And this is somewhat consistent with the model that we mentioned earlier, treating prejudice as derived from a mismatch between stereotype of the group versus the stereotype of the jobs. And so these findings might, in relation to the model that Devyani presented earlier, we mentioned that subjective norms might play an important role in accent bias. So these findings might reflect that people in the UK might have very specific, industry-specific norms that are prevailing in the society, and the exact content of the norms, do they actually include accent, or do they include class, or what are these norms, and the functions of these norms, how do they actually function to lead to influence judgment? These should be subject to future research. So this is it. Thank you very much, and I believe that Devyani and I can take some questions from the audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Yang and Devyani. Thank you very much. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay. Yes. So excellent. So because I've been recording this, I'm going to stop it now. I think we can stop the recording, and this way we can access the chat.